Welcome to this experiment of trying a live Q&A about how comics were made. Appreciate all of you for being part of the Kickstarter campaign, or if you later came on and pre-ordered the book, appreciate that as well. Very excited about the book getting picked up by Andrews McMeel Publishing. If you haven't heard the news, it's going to be out in a trade retail edition in June, which is very exciting because there's a lot of people outside of the US and Western Europe who said, hey, I'd like to get a copy, and spending $150 for shipping doesn't sound that exciting, or whatever it might wind up costing due to the vagaries of international shipping. So glad to see people here, and you are welcome to start asking me questions in the Q&A. I have a variety of materials off to my left, Julia Child like to pull up and show, but I'd love to know what questions you might have about the book, things that you're curious weren't answered. I don't have a hand. I don't have to go reach behind me to get a copy of the book. You can see me stretching into invisibility. I am, of course, wearing a Peanuts shirt and using a background from the Schulz Museum because, of course, that's was a big part of how this book came to be, was the help from those folks. Can folks post anything in the chat? I'm not seeing anything, so I don't know if people don't have questions, or you're here just for show and tell is fine too. I got plenty to show you. Can somebody try sending a message in the chat? I'm afraid that I've actually suppressed it or done something weird. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. All right. As long as people can hear me. So go again, I'll keep the questions open. Let me go through a few things. There's stuff that I couldn't put in the book. So, well, you know, this is, all right, here we go. This is the, obviously, this is the book. The first exciting edition. There will be others that follow, and but you've got your hands on the original Kickstarter exciting edition. And so, you know, part of what led me to write the book was my interest in these materials I kept collecting. And one of the things that I found, it was actually easier originally when I started to find older artifacts, things that seemed I thought I might not be able to find at all, like the flongs, the printing molds, like these Peanuts flongs. I'll hold some up. You probably saw these in the campaign, and they appear in the book. This is a Peanuts from, what's the date on it? It is, got to squint my eyes to see the copyright. This is from 1976, September 5th, or sorry, 1976, September 5th. And right now, if you go to gocomics.com, they're rerunning strips from the 70s. So it's actually kind of fun to see some of the items I have these flongs for show up in the printed newspaper and also at gocomics.com. Oh, I got a question here from Scott, where the word flong came from. Well, I could spend a half an hour, but I won't. I actually researched this extensively for, well, my own interest, and also a chapter in an upcoming book I mentioned very much in passing. So, you know, this book is about comics and the kind of intersection of printing and comics, and how various aspects of printing technology affected what cartoonists could do and how cartoonists had to work within those constraints. And at the same time, or actually before this, I started working on a chapter for a book that's going to be out from the Proceedings of the British Academy of Science, I think, something like that, from Oxford University Press. I contributed a chapter, very academic in nature, on flong, of course, flong and stereotypes, the metal plates. And I thought somebody must have, somewhere I can find where the word flong came from, right? There must be an answer. And the best I can come up with is that there are these two Swiss Italian brothers who traveled first from Switzerland to France, to Paris, and then to London, and set up a very successful business in the printing industry. And they created a lot of innovations. They were involved in electrotyping and stereotyping and flong making. And it was Bartolomeo, and the last name will come back to me. And they apparently, one of the brothers, ostensibly, this is a story that was told decades after he died, ostensibly used to point to this kind of, so these materials I'm showing you here, like this Peanuts flong, you can see it's very thin. It's kind of cardboardy in nature. It's flexible, but it had to be robust enough to retain an impression. So under weight and pressure, weight and, you know, the pressure that was pushed against it, it would embed a plate into this flat material to produce this mold that could then be cast. So the this is the kind of actually a second kind of flong. I mentioned in passing in the book that there is the original flong from the 1850s was a mix of a kind of like flour paste mixed with sheets of tissue paper and blotter paper. And so that would be beaten with a special flong brush on a flong table and then heated and then peeled off after it had dried or had set. And that flong kind of looked like flan. So the flan connection is apparently one of the brothers would say, oh, it is my flan in his Swiss French accent. And people, his workers, the English workers would hear it as flong. So that is the rumor, and as I say, this comes from the late 1800s. I can't find any authoritative source, but I have found in the book, you'll see there's an illustration of a guy at a table. Let's see if I can pull this up quickly with the random access medium of using, here we go. So this illustration in the book shows a man at it. Oops, I got to get it so I'm not being erased here. It's the fun part about green screen erasure. So he is using a flong brush to beat a piece of wet flong, this mixture of paste and tissue paper, onto a table. At the very bottom, you can see it'll disappear when I get too close. It says, it's crazy. It says flong in tiny type at the bottom, and that is from, what is that? 1862. It's just the earliest appearance I found, and the story is from at least 20 years later. So anyway, flong is a great word to say. It was one of the most exciting things I found, and it's the missing. I thought originally I was going to write a book just about flong because it was the missing piece, right? It was the missing chain between kind of these older methods of printing and the newer ones. In the end, this is, I think, a more engaging subject. Like I have the academic chapter that will deal with the entire history of metal plate making and mold making and paper and using other materials. And this is the fun one, which is how does it relate to the history of newspaper comics? Emily had I think that was my super exhaustive answer. I'll be faster on the next ones. People more questions. Emily asked, do the techniques for printing comics and newspapers differ from printing comic books? If so, how? And you can see these folks who just arrived. You can go to the chat button there, click that, tap that, and you can enter questions as we go. They're really very similar. The reason there's so little representation in the book, there's almost nothing in the book from comic books, isn't that they use a different process, but it's a rights issue. So the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, they have some comic book related plate and other material, but I found it too hard to track down who owned the rights for it, and it felt a little bit off to the side when I had better examples that were more straightforward about newspaper comics. I think there might be another book that could be written that's kind of this book, but about comic books, and maybe I will do a version of this about comic books, but it would involve first going to all these different rights holders, because comic books are a late enough invention that most of the material starts in the past the copyright, the public domain watershed, which right now is 1928 in the United States. So I would have to go to DC Comics and the successor rights holders for early comic books, for Batman, for Richie Rich from the 50s, like all of these comics that are out there. And before I wrote it, I would want to get permission that I could reproduce it. With this book, I was kind of going in parallel. I was talking to the syndicates, to rights holders, to cartoonists, to estates all along. All of them from the very beginning were like, yeah, I'm sure we can make it work. And then I was able to finalize everything in time to get it on press. And a couple of things happened at very much the last minute, but everyone was incredibly cooperative. But comic books tend to largely be owned, I shouldn't say, I mean, this is a gross generalization. Comic books tend to largely be owned by companies that produce them. So some rights have reverted. Some comic book creators own enough rights. Some things fell out into the public domain because they weren't renewed, but it would be very hard to illustrate it. So I think the biggest difference is with comic strips in newspapers. The syndicates created one set of materials, distributed it out to newspapers, and then you wind up with, or I'll turn you wind up with things like, again, fresh out of the oven. I'll grab some things from behind me. So you'll wind up with things like this. So like this is a flong that I think was probably created by a syndicate. This is an old Muggs and Skeeter from, I gotta look at the year somewhere here. It's needs some light. 1939, and look at the size of this thing. So that's, that's a comic strip from 1939. Here's a Doonesbury from, the 1970s that appears on the cover of the book, and you can just sorry, keep disappearing. You can see the scale difference. So it's very likely that a syndicate would have produced this, sent it off. They would have produced it from something like this, a zinc plate. This is from a peanut strip from that's in Danish from the 1970s, I think. And this was a zinc plate that would have been used to make the flongs. So all these materials, here's a lead plate that Doonesbury was showing you that survives. This was probably cast out of newspaper and used in layout. All these things survived because newspapers just didn't throw everything away, or because people seem to find stuff. I'm thinking they found things at newspapers, like this. I don't have it handy because I've kind of got it wrapped up, but if you flip open the book to the Doonesbury chapter, it's page, let's see if I can get there quickly again. I have a huge spread in page, almost there. You can see it. Here we go. Pages 156 and 157. If there's this big spread of flong, right? And that's almost full size, basically, or is full size, just about. And that set of 6 flongs from Doonesbury from 1973 survived because I have to assume somebody who worked at the newspaper saw it was pulled, because those were the Ehrlichman strips that couldn't run because they were no longer germane, because Ehrlichman had resigned by the time they were supposed to run. Put it aside and said, oh, maybe this will be valuable historically. Took it home, stuck it in their attic, and then it showed up on eBay 7 years ago. And I'm thinking, was it an estate sale? Did somebody remember they had it 50 years later, 40 something years later? When I was emailing with Gary Trudeau about this, he said, I sent him the chapter to make sure it was accurate. And he said, more or less, like, it's so long ago, like he barely remembers it. It was, 50 years ago that these events happened. And so he was glad that I sort of redocumented it for him. A lot of it's in the record. He remembered some things you can see quoted in the book. But anyway, so all these materials kind of for newspaper comics went all over the place because there were so many newspapers involved. They went globally, and some of them survived. So some very tiny percentage of all the newspaper comics material survived. From what I can tell, comic books, they're, not only were they're essentially controlled, right? There were comic book companies or even individuals or small companies that produce them. They contracted with printers typically. I don't know that most comic book companies owned printers. They almost always had a partner that did that part. There might have been integrated ones, but I'm not aware of that at all. And then those printers would have kept those plates and flongs, all the other materials, proprietary in-house. They wouldn't have gone elsewhere. And when they were done with the lead plates, they would have just melted them down. You can go on eBay if you really want something very expensive. There's people selling old full stereotype, the curved stereotype plates for rotary presses for some comic books, and they want $1,500 or thousands of dollars for the plates, and maybe they're worth it. I don't know. They're not unique, but they're very rare. So maybe for the right collector, there's something they want. So I think that's primarily it. Is that so the main question is, or main answer is, more or less printed and prepared the same way, but fewer steps, because everything would have happened in the printing plant instead of the syndicate producing elements, sending them out. So all these extra generations. And then the reason it's hard, I didn't talk about it, it's hard to find documentation about it, is there's just less material that survived. I hope that answers the question. Emily, Cobalt, please, asks, flongs didn't use dot screen or toning, right? That was only later with zinc plates used by newspapers. Well, this is what's interesting, right? Is the Ben Day process, which you can find documented in the book in, how early do I get to it? It's probably, you write a book, it's only 300 pages, and if I could tell you the order everything appeared in, I'd be a better person than most people. Starting on page 88 is always rely on the Ben Day artist. So Ben Day dates to the late 1800s, and it was probably used with a multicolor lithographic process, chromolithography. And so dot patterns, dot screens, and toning definitely are contemporaneous with wet flongs and dry flongs. And what's amazing, if you look at page, I got a reference for everything, don't I? There's a flong that I saw at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They'd actually got in touch with me because I'm the flong guy, right? Everybody, you want to know Well, you got a neat flong. You call Glenn, but it's true. I get really cool emails. I had to reproduce it incredibly tiny just because I didn't have the size. I would love to do another edition where I had a little more room. But you see this item here. This is a flong from what is that, 1891, and there's tone in it. It's a line art item that's been reproduced. I don't think they put toning on it, but you can see incredibly fine details, like very fine lines. But not long after that, you can find, you can look in old newspapers, scan newspapers, the ones you purchase, and you'll see Ben-Day dot patterns, just like they're being advertised or in patents. So in the book, you'll see a patent for the Ben-Day process, and if you look up the patents, it'll show different kind of screening patterns, and you can go and find those in like Crazy Cat, in other comic strips, other uses in the paper. So they were actually using the Ben-Day process to apply essentially an ink layer of these dots onto the zinc plates, which were then etched. And wherever they put the, so you had both the photo exposure, you take an image like some original artwork, like, well, I have some original artwork handy somewhere here. Oh yeah, so here's oops, if I can reach, again, I'm reaching around behind my back here. Sorry, I was organized for a second camera. Look what happened. I know I have an original piece of art. I've got some other stuff I'll show you here in a minute too. It's uncovered in the files. So if you have an original piece, well, I can tell you without showing you, I guess. Oh, here we go. Here's a useful thing. So here's an original piece of art. This is sent to me by Dan Martin, who is the current Weatherbird cartoonist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which Weatherbird is a little spot illustration that's been in place since, boy, I wish I had it right in fingers. I think early 1900s it started, and there's been only 5 cartoonists. 2 of the cartoonists involved lived to over 100. So Dan is, I want to say, is the 5th, and he met 2 of the previous ones, even though some of them had tenures of 30 to 50 years. A fascinating thing. So these little, like, everybody in St. Louis expects these Weatherbird. And so you take a piece of original art and you'd photograph it, and then using the negative, you'd expose it onto sensitized zinc, and it would get etched, right? But the other thing you could do is, after first exposure, before it's etched, there's like a layer that's essentially visible, and then the Ben-Day artists, that's where they come in. They apply ink by using screens and carefully shading, like rolling or burnishing dots on top of that. And the utility is that this ink is also resists, it's acid resistant, so they can take the layer of ink and the already exposed parts of the plate and essentially etch that whole thing away. And so it's a very complicated process. You can see the many steps in the book, but it meant that you're able to apply toning through the Ben-Day process in the on the zinc plates, which then were turned into flongs, which were then turned into into lead alloy, which were then turned into flongs, into lead alloy, and on. The several generation process. At some point, the Ben-Day process goes away, and I know it's after the 50s. So I found a lot of documentation in the 50s about companies, engraving firms using Ben-Day happening in house, and then at some point, photographic methods become good enough for the production, for exposing the plates with all the dots or lines or other patterns that Ben-Day would previously be used for. Those would be exposed entirely photographically onto a zinc plate as well. So it was all then done through photo etching, involved a lot less craftspersonship. The results were a little different because they're a lot more even, but they also was dramatically more efficient. It reduced the cost of production and increased the speed of production incredibly. Please follow up if I didn't answer that question thoroughly. Emily's got a question here. What was the most surprising thing you learned about while researching this book? Oh gosh, that is a great question. I feel like I learned so much. One thing, there's a whole chapter about the yellow kid plate that they acquired from the late 1890s at the Billy Ireland, and I'm still baffled and fascinated by it because no one's quite sure what it was used for, and it closely resembles the comic as it appeared in print, but not exactly. So there's some story there that's yet to be found that all the pieces may not know. So I was fascinated by that. It's funny, I have to flip through the book to remind myself of things. What was the most surprising thing? Gosh, I think oh, it's so funny. I think finally teasing out it's not surprising, I guess, but it took me a long time to tease out all the Ben-Day elements, and then I would keep finding more pieces towards the end where I was able to fold those back in and put more artwork in to show, or photos or so forth. As far as I can tell, there's no surviving examples of a Ben-Day apparatus. People have told me there's one, but I can't seem to find an institution that has it. So if it's out there, I would love to know about it, but I don't know. That would be a great surprise. I think the other thing is, here's a surprising thing, but it's kind of, I mean, sort of boring at one level, but interesting. And I actually have an example to show you too, is I couldn't quite figure out the transition between sending material like this. So this is for Sunday comics, for color comics. So this is the Peanuts flongs that are in the book. There are 4 colors for cyan, yellow, magenta, and black to make full color. And the syndicate would have these made up and sent out for production. So newspapers that did their own color or contracted with their own firms would use these to make they used each of these flongs to make a separate plate and produce color Sunday pages. Well, there was a gap there where I thought, well, how did they transition from that? What did they do if they weren't sending negatives to printers to strip up and create their Sunday pages before offset came out? Something must have happened. And what I found is, and I found a box of this at the Billy Ireland, and I didn't have sort of time or room to put it in. There's a box of Rob Armstrong, who does Jumpstart. It's a great comic strip. It's been around for decades. Rob is the inspiration for Franklin, Charles Schulz's character Franklin, the pioneering black character in newspaper comics, despite Charles Schulz not being black. And then black artists followed, and Rob is one of them many years later. And Rob became friends with Sparky Schulz and is on the board of the Schulz Museum. And it's a great story. And so when Schulz needed a last name for Franklin and given him one, he turned to Rob. So Rob Armstrong knows this stuff. Been around for a long time as designs and writes great characters, great strip. So Jumpstart, I found a box in his papers at the Billy Ireland that's just paper color separation. So one for each of these process colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, black. And I was still sort of mystified. And then later, with the help, someone emailed me about some Star Trek separation they saw. And I think what the answer is, and I bought a set just the other day from eBay that I hope I'll be able to get permission in a future edition to reproduce. I believe this is copyrighted by maybe Paramount now. It says a creation of Gene Roddenberry. It's a Star Trek comic strip, which despite my incredible geekiness about Star Trek growing up, I did not know existed. I think this is from the 70s. It doesn't have a year or copyright notice on it. Oh no, there it is. It's 1981. Yeah, Paramount Picture Corporation. So very likely would have to work with them to do it. But these are 2 colors, and they're high enough resolution for reproduction. I don't know if I can get close enough. You can see there's a screening pattern behind that. So it's both the it's some stuff different. It's the black plate at top, and then what's next? It's the blue or cyan plate, and then on the next sheet is the other 2 colors is yellow and magenta, or sometimes marked as red. And you can see the Star Trek in different colors as it's knocked out of the title panel there. Let's see if I can get that to show up. Yeah, Star Trek. Woohoo! So my expectation now is that, or my understanding now is that some newspapers might have gotten negatives. The syndicate would have had its firm or in-house would have shot negatives of each of the 4 colors that they'd separated into and sent the negatives to some newspapers, and ones that they didn't, they would send these paper separations, which would then be shot onto negatives and exposed onto plates. But during the transition from metal relief printing to offset printing, where offset printing is all essentially photographic exposure, there's no metal relief, there's no etching or lead, it's all exposure, hardening or selective hardening of plates material, essentially. I believe they could use these as well in that state. Now, the stuff I've seen from that later era, I think there were more photostats, which are on a slicker material, so they would have held the dot better. This is just plain. It's nice paper, but it's plain paper. But the screen frequency is so low, that is the pattern at which the dots repeat, that I think it's high. Sorry, the screen frequency is so low, meaning that it's very coarse. There's a smaller number of lines per inch I was measured, so fewer dots present. The dots are bigger. I think that's how they managed to do it from what feels like just plain, slightly nicer paper than like a bond paper, a bit heavier and thicker. Here's something also cool. Speaking of the of this era, this is a sheet of Superman comics. So this would have been sent by the Tribune Media Services, and it is signed by one of the artists, by Peter Kupperberg. Kupperberg, I'm probably saying his name wrong, who I tried to get in touch with to see if he had memories of this strip or wanted to talk about it. I was unable to. But so this is a week of 1984 strips. This is how they were sent out in later days. So you didn't get a flong. The syndicate would send out this on slick paper. They would actually, you can see in the book, thanks to the wonderful photos of Margaret Miller. Margaret Miller Ruther is her, she uses both names professionally. There's a part of the book where I show you these great pictures that I was so ecstatic to get that show actual production in the syndicate that I didn't think anyone had documented it. And she did almost by accident for a children's book. And so you'll see oh yeah, here we go. So this is the photostat operator, right, shooting strips down there. And then on the next page, I included a couple photos. They would actually, whoop, let's see if we can make that work. Keep it from disappearing. Where have I? Oh, this is a fun battle, isn't it? There we go. So this is the, this material is, they're actually had a little press in-house at the syndicate that let them print a single color daily strips onto a slicker paper like the one I just showed you, which they could send out and then could be photographed. So I've got that, and then there's also, I found King Features Syndicate. So that's Tribune Media. This is 6 days worth of Ripley, believe it or not, from King Features from, what year is that? 1979, same thing. So already in the transition where some of what they're sending out is positive material that would be photographed and photo etched or used as offset by some early newspapers in that era. Again, please ask follow-ups so I'm not hitting the answers there. Mike asked, it was interesting to see how you included chapters on the current comic process. Can you talk about how you reached out to contemporary artists like Dave Kellett and Brad Geiger? Dave has become an old friend. I met him when he and Fred Schroeder were touring their film Stripped, which is a great movie about the history of comic strips. Hey, you should go and get a digital copy of it and watch it. It's available in a lot of places. Stripped is, you know, just like I was shocked and amazed to be able to email with Bill Watterson to get his permission and his syndicates to include originals and printed art of his Calvin and Hobbes, and to get Michael Chabon to write the foreword for the book. These are all completely overwhelming to me. So I'm going to catch my throat even saying it. Dave and Fred, Dave has been a webcomics artist since the late 90s. Brad Geiger as well. The two of them has been buddies forever. Fred is I think a cinematographer, and the two of them have this idea, made Strip, did 2 Kickstarter rounds, and they reached out to Bill Watterson. I think he did an interview for them remotely, I think literally with a tape deck. So they never met him or talked to him directly. I think they talk about this. But he also agreed to do the cover art for the movie. So when you look up Stripped by Dave Kellett and Fred Schroeder, you'll see, oh my God, it's an original piece of Bill Watterson comic art. It's incredible how supportive Mr. Watterson is of the history of the medium. It's great, given that he had such an impact on it such a short period. So I've known Dave. I met him at an XOXO festival in Portland, I don't know, about 12 years ago, and then I interviewed him for a podcast I was doing. I wrote some stuff up for The Economist when I was writing for The Economist regularly about digital culture, the Babbage column there, and just have kept in touch. And so Dave and Brad launched a podcast called Comic Lab, which if you're somebody doing Kickstarter or cartooning, I think it's incredibly interesting to listen to Comic Lab, because what they talk about, it's not just comics, and you get some comic history, you get some art tips and some tips about how to build websites and, you know, stuff that's very specific to marketing yourself as a comic artist, growing as a comic artist, as a web comics artist in particular. But Comic Lab is also incredibly good advice for the burgeoning Kickstarter crowdfunding person. And I've learned so much from it, and I've got to fold it back. I've thanked them repeatedly. And so, of course, I reached out to them both because they're 2 of the longest running web comics artists in the field. They speak so knowledgeably about it. Dave Kellett has 2 different degrees in, I think 2 master's degrees in comics history, studied in Oxford, if my recollection is correct, for one of them. And, you know, I opened the book, the first quote in the book, I believe, is from Dave, because he said it best. So I really respect their understanding of the field, and I was glad to be able to include artwork by both of them, because I think they both have they have their own style. I don't know if it ever would have succeeded with their humor and interest in the newspaper. That was once time their goal, but then they were able to pursue their own course, and I love that. Ed asks, that same thing. There's a few other contemporary artists like Lex Fajardo, by the way, who's the editorial director at the Charles M. Schulz Creative Associates, which handles all the editorial products and the oversight of it. So when Schulz material, Peanuts material appears in books, they produce their own books, they produce other material, they kind of oversee the legacy, the creative legacy of Schulz. Very interesting and super lovely people. And so Lex has his own, privately, has his own webcomic that's been running for years, kind of different format. Like it's a page-based thing, but it shows up in different mediums. So I was able to include Lex, and Kate Beaton gave me permission to use her strip, one of her strips, and she's a pioneer in that field as well. Just was so delighted. Ed asks, I read the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which has run daily comics for many years now, but every once in a while the strip is only black and white. Why would that happen? This is a great question, Ed. So in fact, I address it a little bit in the book, because everyone should have memorized every page of this book. There is a chapter on daily. It doesn't answer your question though. That I will promise to answer it. There's a chapter on daily comics in color, in which I lean very heavily on my friend and everyone's friend, Benjamin Clark, who is the curator of the Charles M. Schulz Library and Research Center. And Ben had been keeping a file for years that he gave me access to of clippings and thoughts, because I said, hey, I've been looking into this, trying to find the earliest and a record of daily comics in color, because it was very difficult for a newspaper to do that. They were geared up on Sundays with staff, the way the presses were configured, the advertising volume, like all, they could print a week ahead of time, all of these things, you know, so they print the daily paper, and then that night they might print the Sunday comics on a Monday in the advertising section on a Tuesday, and fashion on Wednesday, whatever. So when you're doing color daily, it's a whole other thing. So he gave me his file. I thank him in the book. And so here's the answer, I sort of answer, Ed, which is back in 2019, it's the Sentinel down in Florida. They had a day in which their comics were in black and white, and the papers operations director wrote, they basically messed things up. So they had turned everything into full color enhanced black. So everything was 100% for every color, and they would have didn't have time to back it out. So they just went with black and white. So it would reproduce. My suspicion is something goes wrong every once in a while, and they either don't get the color file from the syndicate. So at one point, any paper that was running color comics up and through the 90s, I think, and I document that a bit in the book, they were doing their own coloring, which is a very labor-intensive task. And Durf Backdurf, who I quote extensively in that chapter, great guy, was a research buddy on this project. He's got his next graphic, you know, he's a very successful graphic novelist. He's got a great historical novel, but graphic novel he's working on, The Secret. You'll get more details soon. I'll be promoting it like crazy because it'll be great. So we were exchanging. We were both at the Billy Island a couple times together, researching side by side. It was great. And so Durf worked in the 80s for a Florida newspaper, and 3 days a week, I think it was, he was rapidly painting this weird opaque liquid onto overlays to do the dailies, and then 2 days a week, either that way or the other, he was doing illustrations for the newspaper. And that's how he cut his teeth and learned a lot about, and just became fast at a lot of things. So at some point, and I think it was, I do document this, I forget the exact year, services like Reed Brennan, which is now part of King Features, they started colorizing all the comics for newspapers and sold it as a service, and then they got acquired by King, and then all the syndicates now, for I think maybe 20 years, all provide color versions for newspapers that want to run them in color. So my suspicion is something goes wrong, they don't get the file, it runs in black and white. That's a long answer to a very short question, sorry. Matt asks, with regard to the Star Trek strip, a friend of mine was instrumental in making a series of books collecting separately the US and UK strips, and there's a link in the chat here, Star Trek newspaper strip. You can search on that on Amazon or on Google to find it. That's great. I love that. I'm sorry it's out of print, but what a great thing. This is kind of the preservationist part of me, is how wonderful to pull that out. Keep that alive. Keep asking questions and I'll pull out some other material here. Let's see if this will disappear. Oh, good. If I hold it next to me, it's good. So this is an interesting one. This is not original artwork. This is a some kind of, I don't even recognize the paper. It's kind of parchment paper, but it would have been a printout of the artwork that the artist created. So the black layer was the original artwork, was already sent off somewhere else. Maybe they photostated it and produced that. This is the color guide for marking up just tones. So you see how there's two different blues. There's like a dark, oop, like a spirit. Let's see if I can fool the system again. There's a darker, it's so good at identifying. There's a darker blue and a lighter blue, and the cartoonist, the illustrator marked throughout. So they'll say things like, they'll mark 20 or what was the other number? There's two different numbers they're using at 20 and 40. And even in one spot, they say 40 or 50 to indicate to the production artist at the syndicate or the newspaper or a printing plant that's handling this for a syndicate, what screen to put on. And definitely seen cases like that before for the dailies where the cartoonist would not apply screens. Like Charles Schulz, this is a conversation I had with Benjamin Clark at the Schulz Museum. Something they'd tracked and helped me narrow it down even further, which was very nice of them, is that Charles Schulz, he at one point was using Zipatone, which is I should have had some around. I probably, oh shoot, I don't know if sheet's handy, but Zipatone is it's a press material, like press type. You'd actually, except it was I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. There are different kinds of it. The kind that was commonly used was cut out, rather. It was adhesive sheet, not a press type. Press type, you had to use pressure to transfer, for dry transfer onto paper. Zipatone came in sheets, and you would cut out shapes in different ways. Different artists had different techniques, and it would adhere lightly to a piece of artwork. So it was used in advertising and in comics. And for some years, Schulz used it, and then he stopped using it for, I forget, it was like 30 years. It's just this long period where he just, I've forgotten exactly. I'll probably look at the index, which the indexer for the book's terrific. So if you look up things like, can I see if she has peanuts, removing shading and digitizing. Yeah, see, I can just go to page 130 and find information. That's the irony, is that one of the artists who worked, Aaron Samuels, who worked with Charles Schulz on handling the colorization, the Sunday coloring rather, of his strips. Her job after he passed away, when they started digitizing things, was to remove the colors she'd applied to prepare them for recolor and then recolor them digitally. So she's removing, it seemed like a funny thing. She's scraping, essentially digitally scraping out all the dots she'd applied on different sheets. But yeah, for instance, I really like this. I say Schulz used dot patterns, used Zipatone, I want to say almost sculpturally, except from everything I can tell, he, at least in the second era in which he was using it, he did not apply it. He had assistants apply Zipatone, which is the only task that he seemed to let assistants use or do. They would do the colorization, marking up color sheets, and they would or color guides for the syndicate, and they would apply Zipatone. But it seemed like for a while, I think maybe for control reasons, he wanted to use shading and cross-hatching to indicate shade. And then at some point, I think the production hassle, especially with reproduction sizes being down, even though he was holding people at bay with it, that was that got to be too much, I think. Let's see. So, oh, I'm sorry. There's more questions. I didn't scroll down. Primitive technology. Mike asks, says, love Stripped and Comic Lab, freelance animator, and their tips on running your own business are super valuable. Yeah, I think actually I think their advice is great if you're just in business for yourself. They're very good. Cobalt asks, this is so elementary, maybe I missed it in your book. You did not. Definition of comic and of cartoon. I think cartoon has been used for centuries as another term for illustration. I wound up having to cut it out. I felt like I defined a comic strip sort of well enough, but a cartoon, boy, I wish I had let me have the text really handy, is I actually did write the text for the book, and you know, I have this like offcut section that's everything that didn't fit, and I'm slowly turning those into newsletters. You know, I've got a comics newsletter. It's free. You can subscribe to. If you go to howcomicsweremade.inc or .com .ink, you can find the newsletter there, and it's also called How Comics Were Made, and subscribe. And so as over time, the stuff I couldn't put in the book, I've been trying to work into newsletter entries. So let me see if I can find this very quickly. It's not a complicated explanation, but it has to do with punch. Oh yeah, here we go. I'll read you something very, very briefly, which is the word cartoon comes from the Italian cartone, card, a full-size preparatory drawing in graphite on paper that was transferred to a wall canvas or other medium for a tapestry, fresco, or similar large-scale work. In English, it grew to mean any sort of preparatory sketch, not a final drawing. So you can see Leonardo da Vinci's cartone, his cartoons for frescoes, hundreds of years before modern comic strips. So here's why this is so confusing, I think, is the magazine Punch in 1843 in the UK published a number of cartoons showing potential parody designs for decorating the Houses of Parliament after rebuilding from an 1834 fire. The fire, by the way, was caused by somebody either named Richard Wobbly or Mr. Wibbly, who it's a whole story about Mr. Wibbly Wobbly. The publication soon used the term for any humorous or political drawing. So the term cartoons shifted from these parodies of literal cartoons, preparatory drawings, to any kind of cartoons. And so that broadened the English meaning of cartoon. Comics comes from a comic, comics meaning humorous material. So comic material, it was often included along with drawings. Some of the drawings were unlabeled and dialogue-free illustrations. Others were photographs with cartoon-like elements on them, like speaking balloons and things, dialogue balloons. So the term comics covered both the writing, the comic essays, and the drawings. And so in early newspaper cartoons, a story usually accompanies the comic. And you can see that, say, in the Yellow Kid that I reproduced in that early chapter. You can see there's a whole story that's alongside this giant, what seems to be a cartoon with all this action going on. Later, comic seems to migrate to refer only to drawings. So comic strip is a set of sequential drawings, although sometimes it's used to refer to a single panel. So multi-panel comics that make the sense of a comic or appear in a comics page in the newspaper. See, it's not fully edited yet, but that's the basic line. So Cobalt, that's exactly right. Cartoon has been used for centuries, and I'll try to define it in the next edition. Stefan asks, speaking of Watterson, I was surprised he got changes to his layouts. I thought the syndicates had all the power, but how is the power distribution between the syndicates, newspapers, and artists? Who got the final say? Well, here's the fascinating thing is what Bill Watterson, I think his leverage, and I know this not from any private conversation I've had with him or anything like that, but there's a book, it's in the bibliography for how comics were made. He does a long interview in a book that somehow I had not encountered until researching this book, and it is Exploring Calvin and Hobbes, an exhibition catalog from 2015, readily available. And Jenny Robb, who is the head of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, she interviews him, and they know each other quite well. And the Billy Ireland is also the depository collection for Bill Watterson. So all of his original artwork and related materials are there, and you can go there and ask to see them, and they will pull original Calvin and Hobbes out. You can just look at them. It's amazing. So Watterson's leverage was he could just have walked away. That was his leverage. When he hit the point that he felt like he couldn't do what he wanted and the comics were shrinking and he didn't have control, and they had the whole fight about merchandising, which he didn't want to do because I think it just didn't fit his notion of what he wanted to do. He kind of won that. He took that sabbatical at one point, and he says this pretty directly that I think it was maybe a sticking point to him. So the syndicates have a lot of power, but he was one of their biggest artists during his peak. And he said, this is what I want. And they went to newspapers and said, you got to run it in an unaltered half-page format. It can't be changed. And most newspapers did. I think I've got stats there about how many did not. And a few ran it in tabloid half-page, so it meant that it actually was a little smaller sometimes than before. And Watterson, apparently, you can see in this interview, he's like, I've already fought all the battles. It's good enough. But he no longer had to worry about the strips being cut up. And in the last chapter of the book, that's kind of its own thing, edge cases, that was kind of, you want to know an Easter egg. Here's a fun Easter egg. I think it's fun, at least. If you bought the book, you probably will think this is fun, too. So there's a page that has layouts, right? So this is showing all the different, well, not all, but some of the different ways Mike was asking about Sunday comics that have throwaway panels, and did Watterson negotiate that this strip can only be printed one way? That's exactly it. So these are sort of standard ways that newspapers might break up a strip as provided by a cartoonist. Here's a couple I put on the side here. Here's a couple Peanuts layouts, which are a little different, but they work, right? And then here are Calvin and Hobbes layouts, and the very bottom one, people who are super aficionados will maybe notice, is the last Calvin and Hobbes strip. So I don't reproduce it, but that is the schematic layout of the final Sunday Calvin and Hobbes. The top two in that page correspond directly to the two Calvin and Hobbes that appear previously in the book, so you can kind of look back at them. Yeah, Sunday comics were designed to be snipped up and used in any way. I mentioned in that chapter too that Wiley Miller came up with a brilliant idea of doing a continuous panel with continuous strip with no breaks, so they could newspapers could run it as a long column and squeeze other cartoons in, which they're already doing, but they couldn't break up his strip because there was no break. It's a continuous piece of art. And so he knew his would always run intact, but also be kind of a thing they didn't need to cut because they already had filled up the rest of the page. I think it's a great business move. It seems to have worked for him. Stan points out, Zipatone seemed so magical when I first got to use it. After a while, it became a pain in the rear. I agree. I've both fond memories of using X-Acto knives and cutting out Zipatone and applying it to things, not in cartooning, but in page layout and books and other stuff I worked on in the newspapers, working on the 80s and early 90s, still with before computers took over entirely. And I sort of have a fond memory about it, cutting out Rubylith, which is a 100% opaque black. It's red, but it reproduces as black, so we cut out a lot of Rubylith. I always like to tell the story about this wonderful woman I worked with in the late 80s when I was at as an undergrad at Yale. When I graduated, I'd already been working at the printing service, the in-university printing service that had offset presses. I spent like 2 years working in a plant, which was invaluable expertise. And I worked with this wonderful woman named Paige Rhinebeck, and she changed her name. Originally was not Paige nor Rhinebeck. And she was a layout artist, and artist in every sense of the word. She could, for those of you who remember the old days, we used to make these key lines. You make a red key line with a rapidograph red pen of a certain diameter, and you'd draw that in with ruling stuff, so it was perfectly square. And then when it went and was photographed in the film department, in the stripping department, they would cut that out and drop in the halftone where it was supposed to go, or other image, right? Paige she was a Michelangelo. She could draw a perfect square or rectangle freehand, and we were all in awe of her. So that talent went away with computers, but it was appreciated at the time. Well, folks have more. It's almost an hour. I'll keep going as long as there's questions, but if anybody has more questions, please bring them up and I'll show you. I'll pull out some more show and tell stuff here. Gonna keep trying to reach. Oh, here's the original. So this is I really dug finding out. Oh, somebody asked, was it Emily who asked earlier about the most surprising thing I found out about was craft tint, which I document in the book to the best extent. And I think, again, like if there's a second edition, so the version that Andrews McMeel is printing, distributing in June 2025 is practically the same book. There's one image changed, slightly different cover. Their name is on it, and my name is on it, of course, too. It's still my book, and they're now the publisher. Some point in the future, if the book sells well enough, I hope there'll be a second edition, because I have found already incredible stuff, and I've got some material already being scanned. I'm like collecting so that I have it in place, getting licensing contracts signed now with cartoonists or other organizations, so that when a second edition comes up, I'm all ready to go, right? So I'd like to talk more about craft tint and some of that, and the materials are pretty thin. So this is, let's see if I can get myself in. There we go. So this is a piece that I think is the only piece of craft tint that I own, and you can see how the artist use a revealing ink, basically. So they expose some parts. There's a lot of line work, and then there's shading, that's lines, and then there's pure tint. So they used it in a very sophisticated fashion for what seems like, I think it was a throwaway editorial cartoon. I could barely find the artist who did it. And this is single tone paper, as far as I can tell. It has one pattern of the same density of dots. And this is something Dan Martin sent me as an example of from the old days. So this is This is these are flips for color separation. So this is how this was done in, maybe the 80s and 90s, is before digital transition. So this was his guide for. So if we flip this all open, they're called flips because flip them open. Let's see if I can do it. I don't want to damage it. It's very nice. And again, I don't have permission to reproduce this, so I need to go to St. Louis Post Dispatch to get permission if I want to show it in the book, which I'd love to do in the next edition. So here's the original artwork on the bottom layer. And then he would, whoops, it's like a little hand puzzle. So here's the bottom artwork. And then each of these, you see there's registration marks in these various corners. And then each of these is marked with the yellow, and he just filled in just with a solid marker is all that's necessary because it photographs as solid black. And thus, for each color is reproduces that color. So this top color of blue, I mean, this is all you need. That will photograph as 100% black and then print 100% blue, even though it looks modeled in as marker. It's not when it's photographed. So these were abundant. This is a very small one. I've seen larger ones. Let's see. Anybody have more questions as we go? Here's I think the only piece. This is this fell out of copyright. This is from the what's the group? Oh, Sponsored Comics Inc. The best comics ever made. This is the only example I own, although I've seen plenty of other good ones. It's a tissue paper. It's a tracing paper overlay of colors. So this is the original artwork on that layer, and then this is reproduced in the book, and then there's the color overlay marking each color with the numbers that would correspond. Numbers that would correspond to a chart that would be used. There we go. Brian has a question here. In comic books, drawing, inking, lettering, other tasks in creating the artwork often seem to be different jobs, but the artists you describe often do all the work themselves. Is that a typical difference between the two media? I think it's just a financial one. Like Charles Schulz was really awfully distinct in controlling every part except the last production stages of his work. He never had a letterer, he didn't have a penciler, didn't have an inker. Nobody was involved in any final stage work except adding color marks, not coloring. And in fact, it's interesting there too, where he would oversee people, and then when he got comfortable with them, they would do the coloring, and he would just mostly sign off on it, maybe have some suggestions. So even that last stage he relaxed a little bit about, but all of the ink work was his, and only things that were added were not ink based. There's a great video you can find. I wonder if I can find it very quickly. It's if you look Garfield, it's Jim Davis. It's like a tour of his studio from 1980 something. Let's see if I can find it. It's on YouTube, so if I can't find it, I'm not finding it immediately. But it's great because it's a tour of his studio, and he just walks people through. Because Garfield was making a fortune, still makes a fortune, and bully to him. He has parlayed that self-referential comic about a comic strip artist with a cat into an incredible empire, which is a hard feat. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, I think it had the greatest circulation at the peak of newspapers a number of years ago, 20 something years ago, before the big decline. So an artist like Davis, who had all the money he could do and didn't need the control over the final stages, he would do pencils. He'd hand it off to an inker. There'd be other people involved in other parts, the people doing coloring, whatever. Like and lettering, the whole thing. And I don't think he didn't care about the strip. I think he exercised and still exercises a tight control, from what I can tell. Like he oversees things. Another good case, Gary Trudeau. I wrote a recent newsletter issue about the persistent myth that Gary Trudeau doesn't draw his own work, even though he has. It's just he hasn't inked his work since about 1971, but he has drawn all the pencils, and you can see these. I went and saw original work at the Yale Beinecke Museum, inked and pencils. Look through his journals there, which are amazing. If you get Brian Walker's terrific book about the art of G.B. Trudeau in Doonesbury, you can see all of this original penciling work, and he's a wonderful artist. But because of the timeliness of what he was doing when he was doing daily strips, he could not adhere both to the scripting, the holding it all together, getting everything produced. And so the syndicate introduced him to a inker very early on, while he was still in college and in grad school by that point. And Don Carlton did 40 something years with him, 50 years, I think, before he retired from it. And then he passed away a few years ago, not very long ago. And forgetting the fellow who's doing it now, but this is always part of it. But Doonesbury, again, huge moneymaker. Trudeau could afford to have a studio, even kind of a virtual one. I think that's actually kind of the biggest issue. When I talk to more recent syndicated artists, there simply isn't the money, and some of them are doing quite well, and some hiring a little bit of help. But most artists in the last, say, 30 years who started in syndication, most but not all of them, there's still some big names at the top with big revenue, are really responsible for everything themselves. I think Bill Watterson is another good case. Bill Watterson, I think he had such a tight vision of what he wanted, and he was working on such tight deadlines. You read everyone's like, why did he quit Calvin and Hobbes? You still see that question. If you read his forwards to his books, he wore himself out. It was too much. He could never keep up with that schedule, and he had said what he needed to say, and he had to move on with his life and do something different, is what it feels like. I'm interpreting a little bit, but he says pretty bluntly, like, he was kind of killing himself with the schedule. But he couldn't have had more people involved because he was working so close to it. So it was too hard. And because of the degree of control he wanted over the inking, over everything. So some people are willing to turn it into a production operation, which they oversee, and they feel they can ensure the quality and consistency. They hire people who are artists themselves. Some inkers are actually cartoonists on other strips that they run or that they work on with somebody else. So the inkers aren't unskilled workers. The inkers are often people who are extremely talented, but they haven't created the strip that has the amount of income that allows us to work. Mike asks, your book has an unusual landscape shape. Can you talk about some of the design choices you and your designer made with that, and layouts? Well, I had this notion from the very beginning that the Doonesbury flong that's super wide, I thought, God, I don't want to trim that down or cut it and do it in two pieces. And then every time I'm looking at things, all the panels, not all the panels, most of them are rectangular and wide. So either you have Sunday strips, or you have wide daily strips, or you have panels that are wide. And some things are obviously oriented more portrait orientation, they're narrow and tall. But I thought, gosh, this book begs to be unfolded. In fact, this binding is lay flat. So when you do this, you see there's a little hole there. That's very intentional. It means you can lie the whole thing down. You won't break the binding. It's glued in place there with a thick band, and it's so that you can open, oops, before I knock over the entire table here, so that you can open something like, if I can go back and find the Doonesbury, you can open this flong thing and you're seeing the entire thing, right down to the middle part there, right? And so that's where I started. I said, I want to do it this format. Working with printers, we figured out an ideal paper size that would fit within presses when getting bids. So there's a lot of parameters about how wide you can go to get, we wanted to get 16 pages onto between both sides onto a sheet. And so that limits you because there's only certain paper widths you can get on certain presses and certain sizes. So a lot of compromises got us to that point, but I think they were good ones. And so, and then Mark developed this wonderful, he and I started working together in, I guess like May 2023, would shoot him ideas. He would produce incredibly beautiful stuff immediately, and I would have minor notes. Most of our working relationship was, hey, Mark, this looks great. Can you do this little thing? He'd be like, great. And then it would be done. And you've seen the book. I would have a hard time being more delighted with the book than I am. I think I rarely work on a project where when I'm done, everything came out right. I think this is pretty great. I can say it because Mark did the design. I provided input and insight, told him my preferences, but he really, I sometimes gave him rough ideas of layouts, and then he would produce something much better. So hire Mark for your books. That's all I can say is he just was an ideal collaborator, and I cannot imagine, I just can't imagine how many people are like him. And then also being an illustrator, cartoonist himself, and a fine artist too, was just terrific because he had that breadth of experience and also would notice things in the art or have input into how things could be presented. Shannon asked, what would you have liked to have in the book, but you couldn't find in time or couldn't get the rights to include? Oh, I really wanted to put material from Mike Peters in, and this is no knock on Mike. I think he's in his 80s now. I emailed back and forth, but I could never kind of nail him down. I just emailed him again actually the other day saying, hey, still love to put your stuff in. I think he's a terrific artist. He has a long period in the industry. His papers are at the Billy Ireland. Mike does Mother Grimm and not Mother Grimm, Mother. What's this strip called? Oh my gosh, I can't remember. It's I have to type in while we're talking. Mother Goose and Grimm. I'm sorry. And he's been doing that for decades. He's been an editorial cartoonist since I want to say 1969, so almost as long as I've been alive. And he still is doing it, even though most people think of him as a cartoon strip artist. He's I was looking through his material and I realized, oh, he literally is posting strips right now for the Dayton newspaper, and but syndicated through United Media through I think through Andrews McMeel's syndicate. So I would love to have his stuff in there. I talked to Nicole Hollander, who did Sylvia, which is in her material. All of her archives are at the Billy Ireland, and I just didn't have room. Really wanted to have her in there, but I found sort of slightly better examples of certain kinds of things. And she has a friend who's handling her affairs right now, and so she's very retired. And I talked to this fella, and it's great. And but I just could not get the sort of timing and material to work. But if I had another chance, I would. I just loved. Nicole was a great. I'm sorry, not Nicole. Sylvia was a great strip. Very interesting, very challenging in its day, and my wife is not a big, it's not like an anti-comic. There's not like a big, what didn't grow up being really excited about comic strips or comic books. And I said, oh, you know who I just saw this material from was, do you remember the strip Sylvia? And she says, oh, Nicole Hollander. And she's like, I don't know why I remember that name. Because it was such a great strip. And she remembers in college, they would read it and she and her housemates would discuss it like it was banded around. So I'd love to get her in, and that's more of a communications thing. And maybe again, hopefully there'll be another edition in a few years, and maybe add 32 pages, 64 pages, some increment of 16, because that's how printing works, and do that. We're at 6 o'clock. I'm trying to think if there's anything else exciting I haven't shown you. Let me show you a few photos before we go. I keep collecting pictures, and some of them I can't use. So this is a great photo of someone loading a oops, let's see if we can get that head. All right, I have to fool the camera. It's a great photo of somebody loading a stereotype into onto a press. It's great, beautiful, crisp, great guy wearing a suit and tie, the whole bit. But I can't nail down the rights. I think they're owned by Getty or one of the. It's from a newspaper licensing, so it would cost like $700 to put in the book, or it's just not possible. I did dig up this image, which is from the. Oh gosh, which newspaper is this from? This is from the Dixie. It's on the what's the newspaper? Oh, I'm losing my mind. The Times-Picayune. I'm sorry, the Times-Picayune, and it's a wonderful photo of a tour guide showing a class of kids a flong on top of a stone, this printer stone with a metal page laid out. I would love to include. I can talk to the Times-Picayune about licensing that potentially for a future edition. This, I think the rights are fine on, but it's kind of a cool image of somebody using a loop to check the quality of a stereotype made, which was something that was done. Great picture of Sparky Schulz from the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle. I don't have the rights for it, but I found another photo I could use, and there's other photos I could license, but a lot of them are very expensive. This one went in the book because there's no, it's an orphaned image. I cannot find out who took it, who owns it, where it came from, and it's been used widely. So in cases like that, I try to make sure I've done all the research so I'm not violating anybody's copyright, and I expect, based on my research, this is an orphaned work or was improperly renewed. So either nobody involved who owns it or any successors or estates is aware of it, or it was not renewed within 28 years as was required before 1977, and so it has fallen into the public domain. David asks, can you give us a general feel for the various costs of all the rights you had to get? Maybe a range of prices. Well, in the end, one of the advantages of working with Andrews McMeel is they have a syndicate division that syndicates some of the most popular comic strips ever produced. And so they worked very closely with me on my edition as we were talking about doing a trade edition. So they were just incredibly helpful and got in touch with me after the Kickstarter campaign and just said, what can we do to help? Because you're celebrating the newspaper comics industry, and there aren't a lot of books that do that specifically. What can we do? And they were very, very helpful and got me in touch with Bill Watterson and helped me arrange rights. And so that became that was good. The Peanuts folks also, like a lot of the material in the book, nobody feels that they particularly own, even though it has copyrighted characters, trademark characters. So some of it was just a dance of, are you comfortable if I reproduce this? And they're kind of like, yeah, we are, because we see what you're doing with it. So in some cases there were, the licensing fees were very reasonable, or like, many artists who own their own work didn't charge me anything to use it, which was also great. So I had a very large line item for licensing. In the end, was able to it wound up being like a fraction of that, and that allowed me to do things like that. That trip I took in April, where I went to see Bill Griffith and look through his studio. He let me look through all his old materials and talk with him about his career. I went to George Crisillo and his wife, he's George the colorist for Doonesbury, his studio, and 3 different Ivy League collections to look at their comic specific stuff, and stuff from all of that wound up in the book. And so that trip, it's not cheap. I'm in Seattle. Everyone knows what it costs to travel these days. I stayed with friends. I economized, but I don't think I would have done that trip. And I think the book would have been weaker. Some parts are very weak without it. Like there's a particular chapter about the one about the Empire Melody. Got so many names. International Comic Company. That's this chapter called No Joke. That's what it is. Myers List has all these different names. The material for sort of the last resting place of a lot of material, particularly company records, is at Princeton. And so I was able to see that and reproduce things in here and get some of the story. So unlike when you're doing a film, where I think the rights issues are prolonged, Dave Kellett and Fred Schroeder had to do a second Kickstarter for Stripped, because the first one was to raise the basic costs, and then they came back and said, look, we have I can't remember what it was tens of thousands of dollars they needed for all the rights to include all the stuff they wanted to, including some insane fee from Disney or somebody to put in like 5 seconds of something. And they raised that money, and so they were able to have a much richer film because of the rights licensing. Fortunately, that wasn't an issue here. In some cases, just hard to track people down. Like the Milt Kniff's material is being represented by an organization that I was able to reach, and was very happy to have his stuff reproduced. Other people were, I know there's an estate out there, I think, Alfred Andriola. I can't tell who owns his stuff. He had no children, and I thought I tracked down a niece or a great niece. And anyway, kind of a funny thing. I celebrate the public domain in the book because it's a great thing for this era, which is early stuff that was pre-copyright. So up through 1928, everything published in the United States through 1928, as of January 1st of this year, is in the public domain, and that will advance 1 year every year for the next I think like 50 years, something like that. Still 49 years. So the public domain is going to gradually open up to include a lot of that material, and then it switches over to the new regime of life plus 75 years, the author's life plus 75 years. That'll be a whole different thing. And also copyright could lapse before 1977. So failure to renew. Popular Science, for instance, failed to renew their copyright for a lot of material for a huge chunk of time. There's no records of the renewal. So a big chunk of Popular Science, I want to say from the 30s to 50s, is in the public domain because they did not meet the technical necessity. In other cases, people didn't put a copyright notice when it was required on printed work, and without a copyright notice, material was not copyrighted during certain periods of time. So you'll see stuff in the book like Horn Engraving. They did a film and a book, and Jan and Ollier Engraving, some other groups, there's just no copyright notices, and so it is de facto. There's no, if somebody from these defunct engraving firms said that you use these without permission, there's no defensible way to discuss that, because it is de facto in the public domain without that, much less the fact that they didn't renew them. Let's wind this up. I think maybe have I shown you everything exciting that didn't make it in? Here, I'll show you 2 last exciting things. How about that? So this is I don't know if we'll be able to see, but it'll come up. This is in peanuts in Danish, and I think Norwegian is called radiserne. Radishes? I think I got that right. And so this is the file document that goes with this zinc plate. And it's somebody must have got a hold of these all from Denmark and has been selling them slowly on eBay. You may be able to find some of these. I don't know how many there were, but it's kind of fun. And the Schulz Museum has a few. And then I've got just an old Blondie Flong and an old oh gosh, which one is this? This is Rex. No, what was it? It's oh my gosh, I've forgotten which one it is. One of the action strips. It's one of the dailies. So I've got some random stuff like this. If I had more space in the book, I would reproduce more of that. And that's the material. So maybe again, second edition, probably not for at least a few years. Has to sell. The first edition has to sell well through Andrews McMeel to make that happen. But then a bigger book with more stuff. And thank you so much for coming out. I just again appreciate everybody being involved with this. This is kind of a dream thing of me to do, a dream project, and it turned out remarkably. Everybody involved on the back end, all the people I work with were so prompt and competent on time. The printers were great to work with. The shipping stuff, I know there were a few, like, if you got a copy and there's damage with it, I hope you've gotten in touch with me. As far as I know, only a handful of copies arrived with any substantial damage. Some corners were bent a little bit, but if you're not happy, just let me know and let's chat, because there's copies in the warehouse. I'll still be selling these, the current edition, for the next few months, and then we'll switch over to the trade edition, and there may be a gap. I may sell out before the trade edition comes out. But again, thank you all for participating in this. Thanks for your attention on this. And if you're watching later, I'll say hello from the past. And again, thanks so much. Everybody take care and have an excellent holiday season. Bye-bye.